Hey, good afternoon. My name is Adam Freed, and I'm a principal at Bloomberg Associates. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's Bloomberg Federal Assistance e311 webinar on preventing fraud, waste, and abuse, where we'll discuss innovative strategies and best practices to help cities oversee projects that rely on federal funding. A few quick housekeeping items before we begin today's program. Please introduce yourself in the chat function, saying your name, the city that you're from, and your role. We ask that you try to keep your cameras on if possible so we can make this as interactive as possible. At the same time, though, please do mute yourself unless that you're speaking so we don't get background noise competing with the speakers. Throughout the program, you can use the chat function to share thoughts, ask questions of the panelists, share innovative things that you're doing to help prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. We'll be collecting these during the Q&A portion of our panel. And during that time, we may also ask you to unmute yourself and come on camera if you're comfortable to ask your question. Finally, all of the resources that we share today on screen, in the discussion, or in the chat will be sent to you after the session and posted online at our e311 website. And we'll post a link to that as well into the chat. Today's session is part of an ongoing partnership between Bloomberg Philanthropies and the U.S. Conference of Mayors to help cities navigate and retain COVID recovery and response funding and funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I'd like to recognize and thank our partners at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Laura Waxman, Dave Gatton, Dave Burns, and Tom Cochran for their ongoing partnership and support. Through our program, cities have been able to ask national experts questions about the federal funding sources available to respond to and recover from COVID-19 and to fund infrastructure projects in their cities. In the past 2 years, we've provided detailed answers to over 320 questions from cities, all of which are posted online on our website and available for all cities to access. We've hosted over a dozen content workshops to address pressing issues related to federal funding, including sessions on grant writing and management, strategies to boost municipal workforce capacity, how to leverage federal funding for resilience projects, and how to work with non-governmental partners. All of those sessions and the materials that we used in them can also be found online at the e311 website. All told, more than 5,000 municipal staff from 1,200 cities have engaged with the program. All of this is part of the local infrastructure hub that we kicked off earlier this month to help cities retain and get access to and better spend the funding that's available to them from the federal government. I'll now turn it over to my colleague and partner, Rose Gill, also a principal at Bloomberg Associates, to introduce and moderate today's session. Rose?
Thank you so much, Adam. And why don't we, without further ado, introduce the phenomenal panel that we have here by going to the next slide. First, I will introduce Mike Carroll, who is a principal at the firm Probity. Mike has served for 24 years in government service. Lastly, as Deputy Commissioner of Investigations at the New York City Department of Investigation, which is the anti-law enforcement agency in New York City that promotes and maintains integrity and efficiency in the vast city government operations in New York. While at DOI, Mike oversaw compliance and regulatory reviews across all city agencies, as well as capital construction and disaster recovery projects. Mike's work resulted in in-depth risk assessment and establishing policies and procedures aimed at reducing corruption vulnerabilities, increasing internal controls, and promoting greater government efficiency overall. During the past 4 years in the private sector, Mike continues to provide risk assessments, compliance reviews, and audit services for government and private sector clients. Teha Duckworth worked for the City of New York for over 10 years, including serving as an Inspector General at the Investigations Department in New York and as a senior analyst with the Mayor's Office of Contract Services in New York City, where she helped monitor compliance with New York City's $15 billion procurement portfolio. Teha has managed and worked with staffs of auditors, attorneys, investigators, and analysts that have provided integrity oversight on large-scale capital and disaster recovery projects. Building on that city government experience, Teha has now utilized her skills in the private sector to assist government and private clients in evaluating and strengthening their internal controls. Matt Jadaki is an executive director in EY's insurance and federal claims practice. Matt previously served as the Assistant Inspector General for Emergency Management Oversight with the Department of Homeland Security's OIG office. He was responsible for providing audit and oversight efforts that helped to confirm that disaster relief funds were being spent appropriately while identifying any fraud, waste, and abuse early. He has worked with numerous cities over the course of his career. So I think we could not be in better hands for purposes of the topic of this particular workshop. And so with the next slide, I'll turn it over to Mike Carroll from Probity.
And Mike, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon. I appreciate you being here with us. Before we get into some of the specific content, I just wanted to go over some of the goals of today. You know, we obviously want to provide a deeper understanding of fraud, waste, and abuse as it relates to federal programs and federal funding. We're going to talk a lot about proactive tools that you can use to identify, detect, and prevent fraud. Some of those tools will be small and relatively simple to put in place. Others are more complex, and we'll talk about them. We're going to talk a lot today by using past examples that we've been involved with and lessons learned from them. And then, as Rose had mentioned, you have two different perspectives coming today. You have myself and Taya. We come from a city inspector general's office in New York, and I also spent some time in Washington, D.C. And then we have Matt, who brings this federal oversight perspective. So you're going to see it through the lens of local and federal and the work that we've all done combined with federal programs. As Adam had said earlier, we really would like this to be as conversational as possible. So please jump in if you have questions, put them in the chat room, anything you'd like to talk about, and we'll try to get to it. Lastly, before I start with some specific information, fraud, waste, and abuse has not been new to the E311 program. There are a lot of good Q&As that are there for the viewing. There's over a dozen that touch on fraud and due diligence. There's well over a couple of dozen on reporting and compliance, where fraud, waste, and abuse are touched on. So there's some really good information there, as well as webinars like this. There was one provided earlier in the year by the DOJ, IG, Homeland Security, and Treasury, which also touched on fraud and waste. And it was an excellent presentation, just something you may want to avail yourself of down the road. Next slide, please. So when we talk about oversight tools, and they come in all different shapes and sizes, a really important tool is just the presence of your oversight program, right? Being present and being seen. And I want to talk about this in the context of a client that we're currently working with, but I also want to mention this. In front of me, what I have is some quotes that I took from a HUD IG for the Housing Urban Development IG. They gave a presentation several years ago on disaster fraud, and they really got heavy into fraud, waste, and abuse. So one of the slides that it was titled, "Don't Throw Away the Dirty Laundry, Clean It." And on that slide, they had these three pieces of information. And the first one said, the existence of fraud, of a fraud policy, and proper handling of fraud is itself a deterrent to clients, vendors, and employees. And I so strongly believe that, right? Presence is half the battle here, putting your program forward and making it visible. We were recently engaged about 6 months ago. We started talking to a not-for-profit that was administering a grant program of $100+ million to applicants who were impacted by COVID. And we had conversations with them in the beginning of our relationship, just about what types of internal controls, what types of due diligence. They were ready to roll out the program, but they had fraud on their mind and they wanted to talk about it. And so we came up with the program. We put some internal controls in place. We worked together. We established a due diligence process for the many applicants that were going to come their way. And I understand, like in a program like this, there's thousands of applicants. You can't do a full-blown vet. But with some real thinking and putting thought into it, there are certain things you can do, just simple steps to really get a sense of, the legitimacy of the applications that are coming before you. So lo and behold, we get to that point, we establish the program, they roll it out. They got about 25,000 applicants that submitted to this grant program, but they can only give out about 3,500 grants. So they randomly select 3,500 applicants. They reach out to them. They tell them they're selected, and they just have to now submit certain documentation in order to actually receive the grant. And here comes the oversight program and due diligence part of it. So they have to upload information, which these 3,500 applicants immediately, they upload what they needed to. The program had a nice central repository in place where all the documentation went into it. It was very easy to read. And in addition to that, in that same central repository, there was a communication tool for the applicants. So from a programmatic perspective, it was great. They had applications in there, supporting documentation, and now you catch all the communication with the applicants going forward, which is also really great for us from an oversight perspective. So these 3,500 applicants that were approved, they submit their information, immediately we see 2,000 plus, no problem. They submitted, it hits all the parameters of the program. They're clearly eligible for the program. They're approved, and then moving on to the next step. But then there was a group of like 1,000 plus where they needed to put more information into the system. Nothing problematic at this point, just, the due diligence process just started being a little more interactive at this stage. Can you clarify this? Can you submit another piece of information? Lo and behold, it starts moving forward. Then it's more applications get approved, and again, slowly, they're reaching their goal of where they want to be. The interesting part about this was there was about 300 applicants that just stopped communicating with the program. They essentially just went away. And we had conversations with the program about that. Why would these applicants who were told they were going to get this grant just go away? And it's a substantial grant. On top of that, it was a sizable grant. So when we spoke to them about it, it's something that we expected to some extent. Look, those 300 applicants, I'm sure there's folks in there who some just got lazy and just didn't finish with the process. There are probably others who maybe, they got a new job. Things started looking better for them and didn't really need the grant money. But I imagine a big chunk of that 300 are folks who were not eligible, potentially committing fraud, who submitted their application, submitted the supporting paperwork, and just waiting to see what is that going to be met with. And they were met with the program that had not many, but some good, strong measures in place. And my guess is they got to the point where they were like, hold on a second, this is too inquisitive. We're just going to leave. And they left 300 applications on the table, and they never communicated with the program again, which is a good thing, right? They were able to then take those 300 applicants and put it back into the portal to people who really needed that money. So that's, just a lesson learned along the presence. That presence makes a big difference, right? Meaningful, thoughtful process to establish a program and let it be felt by the people that are in the program. So in that HUD presentation, they go on and they talk about two other things. They highlight that the occurrence of fraud alone is not a sign of a poorly run and mismanaged agency. And they also say the reaction to fraud is going to define you as an agency, or in this case, a not-for-profit. So again, early on in the process as well, a couple applicants, clearly fraudulent, no question about it. They're trying to steal from the program. We speak to the folks running the program. We talk about it. It was pretty devastating to the folks in the program. It was a real punch in the gut, even though we had discussed fraud. And I told them early on that when you're administering $100 million plus in grants, the starting point is there's going to be fraud. That's the starting point. The real unknown is, what are you going to do about that, right? Are you going to move forward with this program and get money to people who need it, right? So that's the main goal, right? You want to get those funds out to folks, but can you also put simple measures, sometimes not even that extensive, in place that will start to deter and detect fraud? And I think that's what they did here. And I told them, I said, that's not a reflection upon you or your program. It's a good thing, right? If you had nothing in place, yeah, it's a bad thing when fraud comes up. But when you have good programs in place and steps, I said, embrace it, be proud of it. You caught these 2 applicants. You're going to put 2 more people in it that deserve this money. You did a good job, right? You gave the money out, but you also did your due diligence. What else do you do with that fraud, right? How else do you move forward? What you learn from it, right? With these first 2 applicants, we all stopped. We looked at it. We knew they were fraud. But we developed new red flags from these two applicants that we said, oh, those are things we need to infuse into our proactive audits going forward with the other applicants. And then we started to identify more fraud. Not a ton, but we got up to about 10 clear-cut fraudulent cases. And again, that's 10 applicants that are now removed, 10 more people who deserve the money and will get it, right? So I said, be proud of it, announce it, embrace it. It's a good thing. The last thing is, what else do you do beyond that? And I had conversations with a couple of IGs around the country in preparation for this talk today with everybody. I just wanted to pick their brain a little bit about what are you seeing? What are your concerns? And one thing that both of them mentioned to me was operating in silos. And they said they started to see, other jurisdictions having similar issues to them and how important they felt it is to get the word out, to talk to other oversight bodies in your city, to go outside the city, to your state, to neighboring jurisdictions, and share what you learn about the fact patterns, which may be really helpful for other people in their grant programs. And even sometimes the individual actors themselves may be, active in other jurisdictions. And I think this grant program that we were working with is a perfect example of that. When we looked at the bad actors here, none of them were in the state where the program was being carried out. They were all in states far removed. So, which was a clear indication to us, these are bad actors who are doing nothing more than trolling COVID programs and trying to see where can I break in? And I'm going to put it out to 5, 10, 15, 20 programs. And if I get into 3 of them, it's a victory, right? But the ones that they don't make it into, it's important to pass that information on, or otherwise they're just going to keep trying, right? They're going to keep going. So it's important that you share that information with your oversight folks, with your local district attorneys, with other folks who can take it onto a bigger stage and share it with folks. Matt's going to talk later about PRAC, which I imagine a lot of you are familiar with. That's another federal agency that does a great job in getting information out to states and cities across the country. So you want to share information with people like that. So you learn from it. If you're doing a good job, embrace the fact that you found fraud, be proud of it, but share those lessons learned with other folks, right? So they can take away what you did from what came your way. Next slide, please. So before I turn it over to my colleague, Taya, these are just some simple elements of common elements of fraud, waste, and abuse. And I think that, the fraud one is a little more easy to understand. I think everybody knows, right? It's the cheaters, the stealers, it's intentionally deceiving folks to steal money from programs. The waste and the abuse, sometimes I don't know if everyone fully comprehends those. I think the abuse is relatively easy, right? You're using your position, you're abusing the authority you have. Not necessarily criminal, right? It could be for a whole host of reasons, but you're not doing the job you're supposed to do, or you're doing it improperly. The waste I want to concentrate on for a second. Your fraud program, if you get it up and running, right, and you really put a strong one in place, they're more likely to come across waste than they come across fraud on a regular basis. And that's a good thing. Good anti-fraud programs are going to help your program just become more efficient, right? They're going to see needless, careless mistakes that are being made and hopefully catch them, work with the program, make adjustments, new policy changes, and then improve going forward. So it's really important that waste is a focus of your fraud program as well. And I'm working with a construction company at the moment, and as a good example of waste, of how it can really snowball. They were pouring concrete on a parking garage, and they finished the job, and it was completed. And I was working with one of the safety professionals who went out to that garage. He found out that the concrete was substandard. It wasn't meant for a parking garage with that much traffic and that much weight. They had to rip up all of the concrete, right? There was no fraud there, but it was needless. It was careless. It was, just not following through on your job and doing your homework, which ended up being extremely costly to them because obviously they had to redo all the work. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass this on to Taya. Taya is going to get into a really important tool, which is risk assessments. And then she's going to walk through some examples that may be helpful to all of you. Taya?
And Mike, just before we pass the baton ably to Teja, there was a question in the chat box about one of the anecdotes that you were discussing, and we'll follow up with you and on that a little bit later or after the program, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
And with that, I'll turn it over to Teja.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. So first I want to talk about risk assessments, which is a great management tool when it comes to fraud, waste, and abuse. It's really powerful in that it can help assess the condition of your program. And once you've done a risk assessment, it can also be a roadmap for continued monitoring throughout the life of a project. So essentially, a risk assessment allows you to be able to dissect every aspect of a program, to understand the key players, their roles and responsibilities, procedural expectations, and whether or not they're being followed, and any gaps that need to be filled that will detect and reduce the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse in your program. As Mike had mentioned, in our history of providing monitoring and oversight on various projects, including large infrastructure and COVID-19 projects, a risk assessment is always our first step because every program is different and you want to make sure that your assessment is tailored appropriately. Next slide, please. So as part of the risk assessment, ensuring sufficient oversight of your program will not only support compliance of the use of federal funds, but will also help you to establish that fraud presence that Mike had discussed. You'll want to focus on your organization's staffing and level of experience. For example, in addition to the grant management experience that you're looking for, particularly for infrastructure projects, staff with construction, engineering, and safety experience may also be needed. So this is the time to really do that assessment and fulfill those roles that you may need. You also want to keep in mind the methods that you'll be using to provide oversight to your recipients and sub-recipients on your project, because you want to ensure that they are compliant with the federal award, but you also want to make sure you're on top of them because this is an area of constant negative audit findings. Next slide, please. So the next area I'm going to discuss is understanding 4 common areas of fraud, including MWDBE, procurement, bribery, conflict of interest. And then I'm going to pass it back to Mike, and he's going to discuss the importance of audits. Next slide. So when it comes to fraud, waste, and abuse, the question we get the most is, what should we be looking out for? And the key to understanding the dynamics of fraud, waste, and abuse is to first be well knowledgeable in the specific requirements. Now, I know there's a lot of information here on the screen, but for the purpose of the presentation, we're going to focus on some key areas. Now, when it comes to MWDBE requirements, the key is ownership interest in the company, having at least 51% in the relevant diversity category, and also being able to independently provide the relevant services for which you were procured for. In many instances, a legitimate MWDBE can be used fraudulently, and an MWDBE company can be used as what we call a pass-through or a front company. And I'm going to show you how this plays out in our next case study. Next slide. So for over 4 years, the construction company MCC used 2 MWDBE firms as front companies to essentially obtain government contracts illegally. The MWDBEs did not provide any services themselves. Instead, the MCC did all of the work. Remember, as I mentioned before, a legitimate MWDBE must be able to provide the services independently. Now, the reason that this was discovered was because the contracting officer actually questioned the nature of their relationship. And as part of the review, false statements were made to cover it up. So if you're not out there checking your MWDBEs, then you won't see these types of red flags. MWBEs are often unaware of the ways in which they can be taken advantage of. And so educating them, in addition to your internal staff or compliance field folks about these red flags, will help them to be able to proactively monitor these types of risks. Next slide, please. Another area of high risk fraud is procurement. Mike had mentioned briefly the importance of transparency and documentation, essentially at every level. Now, I know when it comes to oversight agencies, they frequently say document, 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 and it really seems so simple. But the vast majority of negative audit findings is that things aren't actually properly documented. So you want to make sure that your organization is memorializing their actions and decisions throughout the process. In addition, your internal staff and potential bidders must be aware of their roles and responsibilities to ensure checks and balances and to properly conduct themselves when engaging in communication. Because a lack of a strong procurement process can lead to misconduct. And one of the types of misconduct is bid rigging, which will be relevant in the upcoming infrastructure projects that your organization may have. Next slide. So for our procurement fraud case study, we focus on bid rigging. Bid rigging occurs when employees or contractors collude to manipulate the process. And what I like about this case study is that it includes more than one type of fraud. It has MWDBE and procurement fraud. Here, the contractor engaged in both MWDBE fraud because they used 3 small businesses as pass-throughs, similar to the case study that we spoke about previously. But what also stood out here is that they took it a step further, and they even prepared the bids and the prices for the small businesses to submit to the government. And then once the small businesses actually had the contracts, the contractor even had access to their email and was submitting correspondences to the government on their behalf. So the small business had no independence from the contractor, which raises numerous red flags. So to kind of address this, you want to be able to establish a culture of integrity in your programs. And one of the ways in doing so is implementing a code of ethics. And you can do this and also train your staff and the bid community about your expectations on how they are going to engage in the process. And then in real time, you can also conduct audits of your procurement process so that you can identify any red flags that may exist. Next slide. So the next area I want to touch on is bribery. And this is one area that can quickly grow out of control. And when the first thing that comes to mind regarding bribery is a quid pro quo, right? Essentially a favor for a favor. And for government employees, this is highly prohibited. Taking something small, even a gift basket or lunch, can lead to more gifts of higher value, such as dinner or tickets to a baseball game. And before you know it, after having that small lunch, you start to feel like the contractor owns you. And so I want to kind of discuss a case study. Next slide, please. That talks about bribery, which is also compounded with a little bit of procurement fraud. Here, a government employee accepted bribes for steering a contract he oversaw to a contractor for telecommunications services. And there's really a couple of key areas in here that I want to touch on, right? For one, there was no procurement process. There was no competitive bidding. The contractor demonstrated no experience or expertise in telecommunication services, yet still received the award. And then during the actual scope of work that they were performing, the contractor created a fake job to funnel payments to one of their relatives. So this guy was kind of doing it all. You have procurement, you have bribery issues. And like I said before, when you have a contractor who may offer you something and you accept it, that relationship can completely change. And it can change to the point where now you may be accepting or expecting those types of gifts and actually reaching out to the contractor in order to even provide more gifts. And so you want to make sure you kind of avoid those types of relationships and or temptations. And you can do so by implementing a zero gift policy in your programs, right? This will be able to inform your employees as well as the contracting community that all city employees are prohibited from accepting gifts. And then if bribery does occur or any sort of misconduct, you want to be able to report it easily and anonymously. So you want to have a hotline available as part of your program. And you want to be able to post these in public spaces so that anyone can report any misconduct that they observe.
Yeah, Tanya, if I can just add one thing to that. So when it comes to the contractors, and Tay and I were talking about this morning, right? I think when we were with the city, we were always constantly educating our employees about the do's and do nots. Getting to that contractor community is also really important to let them know, the expectations and what is unacceptable. I had a company that I was working with. I was working with them because their employee had paid a bribe, which makes the story even worse. So I was trying to help them with the integrity within the company. And the first lecture I did was with some project managers from around the country. And in that meeting, we started talking about just this, what Tay is talking about with the gifts and small and big. And, and I said to them, I said, look, just make it simple. Because I'm talking to the contractor and I'm like, do not give anything to government employees that you're working with. And it just caused chaos in the room. They wanted to throw me out the window. The idea that they would be banned from providing any gifts, and they all started going into this is from around the country, right? With a gift here or a ticket here, it was just common in what they in how they were conducting business. So, it was very foreign for them for me to say, look, no, city employees, should not be taking, gifts and things like that. So educating that contractor community can be really helpful. Whenever you have the opportunity, whether it's at bid meetings or, other things like that. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It's just, something I learned from during that meeting.
Thank you, Mike.
And Keha, the other thing about this particular case that you are talking about is a great illustration of a number of things that can go awry that may jump off for a number of our city guests on this workshop is that it was a non-competitive bid.
Correct.
So maybe you can discuss that a little bit more here and how the person was able to get away with having this be a non-competitive bid in the first instance.
Okay. So the particular details of the case does not give the reasons as to why the procurement was not bid competitively. However, there are certain ways in which this could have unfolded, right? So one of the examples that they provided was that for purchase orders, they were using generic language to try to cover up that they were buying specialized IT services, right? When in reality, they were buying substandard or standard products, right? So I would imagine they probably used some sort of sole source to kind of justify why they were going to go with this particular contractor. And a type of justification that you can use for that is saying that they're providing specialized IT services in some sort of way that any other company wouldn't be able to provide. And so even though they don't give exact details, that's kind of one of the ways they can kind of get around not doing a competitive bid.
I think that's really valuable because one of the things that we've been talking to a lot of our cities about has to do with the proper deploying the proper procurement rules. And dispensing the federal funding through the various programs, ARPA, infrastructure, et cetera, using the proper procurement rules. And the fact that they were able to pervert that in this particular case, I think makes it a really good illustration. But I think what it really speaks to for our audience is that you have to be very careful in documenting what you're doing and why you're doing it in terms of a sole source or direct allocation as opposed to a competitive bid. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, even when you put your oversight mechanisms in place, and you know you're doing your risk assessments and you're trying to figure out, you know, what are you going to focus on. Certainly, you know, I know we've done it in the past, and when you do have these procurements that are not competitively bid, that needs to be a focus of your oversight, right? To do exactly what you said, Rosa. You got to make sure that, you know, that story is crystal clear, you know, why you opted not to go through that competitive process, why they were uniquely qualified, you know, and all the processes you used to get to that point. Because without that documentation, that transparency, you know, a lot of times orders will go to, this must be fraudulent. You know, this is a systemic issue. So documenting and making it clear of how you made your decisions is key.
Anything that's going to be non-competitive, needs extra scrutiny and extra sign-off and extra documentation. Suffice it to say, this person got away with it. Well, I guess he thought he did. Looks like he went to jail for a little bit, so he really didn't. But if you're proceeding that way, you have to be doing so with prudence and I think extra scrutiny.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Taya.
No, that was a great question. I appreciate it. We definitely want to make sure that everything is justified. Like Mike said, you don't want the auditors to raise red flags that this wasn't documented because you were trying to cover something up. Next slide, please. So the last area of common fraud that I'm going to discuss is conflict of interest. And conflict of interest occurs when an individual's personal interest compromises their judgment or decisions. And these relationships must be disclosed by employees as required by your organization's policies. In addition, contractors, especially during the vetting process, should also be required to self-disclose through written certifications any potential conflicts that they may have. For example, if a contractor hires a former government employee, conflict of interest rules are typically heavily applied to how that former government worker can engage with the government and on public works. So especially during the first or two years after leaving service. So you want to make sure that employees are trained and knowledgeable of the rules to help prevent such violations. Next slide, please. So in this last case study, two issues unfolded in this case that I want to touch on. The first one is pretty straightforward in that the contractor, Cape Henry, failed to disclose that they had ownership interests in a subcontractor who obtained two sole source contractors with the Army and GSA. So that one's pretty straightforward. The second issue is a little bit more complicated in that Cape Henry also failed to disclose their relationship with another contractor, QED. And QED actually had a direct contract with the Navy. And as part of QED's roles and responsibility, they were required to review Cape Henry's proposals and make recommendations for awarding them a contract. And this is problematic because, as the Federal Code of Regulations states, no agent may participate in the selection, award, or administration of a contract if he or she has a real or apparent conflict of interest. And clearly here, Cape Henry had a real conflict in that they had a financial relationship with QED. And so again, education of your employees and contractors on the conflict of interest rules will kind of help alleviate these sort of violations. And one of the ways to do that, particularly with the contracting world, is to have them self-disclose through written certifications, whether it's, your vetting questionnaire. You want them to be able to identify these so that your organization can make a proper determination on whether or not you're going to provide an award to that vendor. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Mike, who's going to talk about the importance of proactive audits and oversight.
Before I get into this, I saw that there was a question that came in from Lincoln that Grace put into the chat room. And I just wanted to address it real quick, if that's okay. The question was, should you incorporate your audit strategies into your risk assessment, which I think is a really good question. I think, the answer to that would be, you're going to do your risk assessments, and I would recommend before you close out that risk assessment, and yes, you document exactly what you're saying in your question. You consult with your oversight folks, tell them, what you're seeing, what you believe are the risks, get feedback from them as far as the strategies they think that should be implemented going forward, and then include that as part of your risk assessment. It shows that you not only identified, but before you're stepping out the door, you're also already discussing what are some of the solutions and things that you can put in place to prevent any problems going forward. So great question, and I hope that answered it. So jumping into the proactive audits, right, along the same lines of these different tools that we hope to discuss with you and for you to think about for your toolkits going forward. So proactive audits, oversight, right? That's that presence. Be proactive, not let folks see you. Real-time desk and field audits are a great way of doing that, right? Real-time as the project's going on, right? You're obtaining documentation from sometimes your own city employees, sometimes from vendors, suppliers, contractors, asking them for information so you can verify and check up on some things that are going on, right? These real-time audits obviously going to establish a presence, right? Because now people are feeling the presence. Oh, they're asking me for documentation. They're asking me for documentation. They really have oversight here in this program. It might deter someone from doing something that they're thinking about doing. Right? So it's constantly, with that presence going forward. And as far as the field audits, right? It's not only desk audits, it's the field audits. And I think that's particularly important as we start talking about IIJA and bigger infrastructure projects that you're going to get involved in. To the right of this slide, I just took a quote from the Coalition for Integrity. They're a not-for-profit entity, and I put a citation to a report that they did on oversight of infrastructure spending. It's an excellent report if you have the time to read it. And it was written for IIJA. It was anticipation of what was coming. But they talk about the complexity of infrastructure projects and how the complexity of those projects, it just does open up the door more for fraud, right? They are complex. They're big dollar amounts, lots of people involved, right? You have your contractors, your suppliers, your vendors. You have subcontractors, and that's a whole nother world of first tier subs, second tier subs, third tier, right? And it trickles down, and there's definitely opportunities. So being proactive on construction projects is crucial before things that are minor, right? A minor issue, proactively, hopefully you catch it, right? You stop it before it becomes systemic. You stop it before, 2, 3, 4 years down the road, the federal government comes in and does an audit, right? What we don't want to happen is we don't want the federal government coming in 2 or 3 years down the road and telling us how we did. We want to know, because we were so proactive with our audits, we have a pretty good sense when they show up that we're going to do well in this audit, right? So proactive audits. And in the field, which sometimes is forgotten about, Taya discussed MWBE fraud, right? Which is a great program that too often gets abused. Field audits is crucial, right? When you're talking about front companies for legitimate MWBEs, getting out in the field and speaking to workers, that's how a lot of those get flushed out. Simple questions. Who's your supervisor on this site? Who do you receive your paycheck from? Where's your office located? Those simple questions, the answers, that could literally be a 30-second interview, right? You don't get in the way of the project. You just ask those questions and you move on. But those answers can be like, red flag, we may have a case of MWBE fraud here, right? So those real-time field audits. And also the last thing with those, as far as construction goes, what you can see today, right, may be buried tomorrow, right, in a construction project. And those real-time field audits to verify products that are being installed, right, to avoid product substitution or inferior products, or making sure compliance with Buy America. You know, we used to use engineers a lot for this, who would go out and do those field type of audits and report back to, you know, to our oversight team is really, really crucial to a program, right? And then you are going to feel better positioned, right, when those IG audits or even your local audits come in, or when you have to have the single audit done, right? You have done those proactive steps and you feel better going into that. And the term clawbacks, right? Something that is raised all the time when we speak to cities. Everyone is, you know, and understandably so, afraid of clawbacks. I make a notation on the top hand of this slide from some past research we did, where Homeland Security noted between 2010 and 2020 over $1.3 billion in disaster-related audits that they did, where they claw back money or they de-obligated money from local government and municipalities. HUD recently came out with a report in November, and that report was meant for COVID spending. They wanted lessons learned for, you know, dealing with the COVID money that everybody has. And they talked about 1.7 million in, you know, de-obligation and clawbacks and things like that they have recovered from audits. So it's something to definitely get you on your toes, clawbacks, but it shouldn't paralyze you, right? Just focus on the program, focus on the presence, and, you know, transparency and documentation is going to be crucial. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll touch on two last things, right? As an oversight component, you're all going to have an internal oversight team or person, right? That's a given. Now the external is an option to supplement, to help your internal team. So your internal team, your oversight team you have in place, things that we mentioned already, make sure they're prominent, make sure they're visible, put out flyers, posters, hotlines. Infuse that oversight team into project meetings, right? Something we should do all the time. Do nothing but even just sit there. I'm not getting in the way. Our oversight folks are going to sit in on this contractor meeting. There's a big change order that you're talking about. Our auditor is just going to sit in and say nothing and just listen, right? From an oversight perspective, hearing what the program is doing and learning about the program is only going to make your oversight team that much more stronger. But you'll also see, even though initially program teams, you know, particularly in infrastructure projects, they don't like oversight looking over their shoulder. They get a little bit defensive. But what I've seen, particularly in these larger projects, when you're there for a while and they get used to you, they actually like it. It's a resource. When they come across things that are a little bit gray, a little bit murky, now they start leaning on the oversight team as a resource to go to before I make a decision that I'm not feeling comfortable about, before I move forward with that contractor, or if I see something, I can bounce it off the oversight team. So it's just, you know, just a few thoughts to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So the last tool I wanted to talk about is the Integrity Monitoring Program. And again, just, you know, tuck this way as a tool, right? Lots of different tools you could use. This might be a tool that would be beneficial to you. It's particularly effective, we found, on larger infrastructure construction projects. What is an integrity monitoring team? So it's where you're bringing in a consulting firm, could be a law firm, auditing firm, investigative firm, and you want that team to be a multidisciplinary team, right? You want them to come into your infrastructure project with auditors, engineers, investigators, subject matter experts, right? If you happen to be doing a wastewater treatment plant, maybe you have an environmental expert on your staff. Whatever the subject matter is, you know, it's this well-rounded professional team that's going to help and supplement your internal team. And this concept, when it started 30 years ago or so, you know, it was really started more reactive, putting integrity monitors in place because, you know, there may have been a problem or an issue. But the benefits of having this third-party independent arm, it started to show what the positive aspects were of it, and it started to be used as a proactive measure, right? And when I say independent, I mean, this IM team cannot report to the project folks, right? They can't report to the head of the construction or your infrastructure project. They need to report out to somebody. It could be the CFO of your city. It could be your oversight entity, to somebody removed. So we implemented these proactively often, right? Everything going back to 9/11 with the rebuilding and the cleanup of the World Trade Center, Hurricane Sandy, integrity monitors, a lot of housing construction projects and rehabilitation projects. We had monitorships in place. And I can remember one, there was a bond being issued to New York City. We met with the folks from HUD. They were not releasing the bond. They had requested that there was an integrity monitorship in place before they would release the money. So we can talk more about this later and love to field questions, but it's a really important tool on bigger projects. And, you know, as far as paying for the monitors, all those projects I mentioned, whether it was 9/11 or Sandy or some of these housing projects that we were on, funded by the federal government through those grant funds, right? They funded the additional oversight and they welcomed it. On top of that, integrity monitors will often pay for themselves, right? In a perfect world, your IM team deters everything and there's nothing to recover. But in reality, they're going to find stuff, right? And I put to the right side of the screen, when we had monitors down at the World Trade Center, from the work they did alone, they documented about $40 million in cost savings, which far exceeded the amount of money that was paid to bring on these monitors to do that function. So I just wanted to throw that out to you as an example. And again, you know, certainly we could speak about this, you know, later today or at another time. Now I'm going to pass the presentation off to Matt, and he's going to get into some really good information with a federal perspective on it. Matt?
Thank you, Mike. And Paul, I appreciate the opportunity to kind of talk from my perspective as a former federal official. I actually worked a number of years, 30 years in the federal government. In addition to some types of things that Rose was talking about, I was also heavily involved as the Special Inspector General of Gulf Coast Oversight after Hurricane Katrina. So seeing something very similar to what we're seeing, you know, with all the money going out, a lot of opportunities for fraud, waste, and abuse. So what I want to do, I want to talk a little bit about who the players. You talk about oversight. Who can you expect to see when you receive these federal dollars? And you know, when you're getting federal dollars, there's always going to be strings attached to some degree or other. So we talked about the inspector generals, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of these areas in a couple minutes. But the inspector generals are basically at, you know, large federal agencies. They're appointed by the president, and I'll go through, you know, some of the areas that they're responsible for in a minute. You can also expect the PRAC, Mike mentioned earlier, the PRAC, the Pandemic Recovery Accountability Committee. It's part of a group of inspector generals that go through what their responsibilities are and the type of work they're producing and the type of oversight they're providing too. There's also the Government Accountability Office, GAO, who's part of the legislative branch, but nevertheless does a lot of work in these types of areas, and they are actually ramping up, and they've received a significant amount of money to do these type of work. And then you have state and local auditors. The state auditors are doing quite a bit of work, and I've been following some of their reports that are out there on a variety of different topics dealing with the pandemic funding that's coming through. And then finally, if all else fails, you don't see those, most of you will probably be subject to the single audit. And the Office of Management Budget has put out compliance supplements that are specific to auditors that are looking at some of the funding, especially some of the COVID pandemic recovery funding. So you're going to get audited by somebody at some point. So what I want to do is quickly go through who some of the players are here. And I'll start with the Inspector General's office. The Inspector General, each of the agencies, major agencies has Inspector Generals. They have a kind of unique role. They're independent to the agency. They're appointed by the president, and they're confirmed by Congress, the major agencies. They have dual reporting authority. They report directly to the head of the agency, but also to Congress too. They retain some of their independence. Typically, they have an Office of Audits and an Office of Investigations. A lot of times, results of audits will result in investigations, so they have a close relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office to prosecute those types of things. And many of the offices of Inspector Generals also have a compliance or a evaluation function too, where it's not as detailed as an audit, but they go in and take a high-level look. It's important to note that The inspector generals aren't part of management. They can't make management decisions. They can only recommend. So when Mike put up his little chart there before about talking about some of the big D obligations and clawbacks going back to, DHS OIG, I was part of that. So the agency can take that or say, no, we're not going to do that. There's a lot of order resolution process that goes on in there. So they can only recommend. They can't force management hand in anything. And there's a number of websites that are out there that will provide information about their audits, their investigations, some of those types of things. I want to spend a little bit more time on the pracs. Next slide, please. We can go through this one. I'm going to talk a little bit more about procurement in a minute. I talked about the role of Inspector General. Next slide, please. And these are some issues that frequently the IG would, if you look in some of the reports, improper procurement practices, unsupported costs, poor project accounting, duplication of benefits, excessive costs, excessive labor, unrelated project, unapplied credits, no direct. These are things that occur throughout the year. One of the things I wanted to talk about, and I want to add on to what some of the things that Mike and Teja were talking about is procurement. Typically, I see the biggest problems when I was with the federal government in the procurement area, and it's a little bit different the way things are working and the way the pandemic funding is coming. A lot of cases you would see funding, for example, a FEMA grant is the state is the recipient and the subrecipients of the local governments that were affected by disaster. So if there's any problem at the local government level, the FEMA, Department of Homeland Security, go to the state for resolution. In the case of the pandemic funding, there are direct allocations to the state, to the local governments, cities, counties, some of those types of stuff. So if there's any issues dealing with, improper procurement practices, the feds are going to go directly to the local governments or direct recipients of those types of things to try to resolve those issues. That's different than what we've seen in the past. And the other big difference is the Department of Treasury, their Inspector General's office. As I mentioned earlier, the Inspector Generals are not part of management. They can only recommend, but the Department of Treasury has special authority through the CARES Act that they can actually recommend and collect the obligations and clawbacks too. So that's a little bit unusual for a Department of an Office of Inspector General. The reason procurement is so critical, that is probably the number one area where I've seen the largest clawbacks. And I got involved in quite a bit of this after Hurricane Katrina, and the Inspector Generals are taking a really hard look at procurement. It used to be that they would maybe look at a procurement if a couple rules, regulations weren't followed, if there wasn't a proactive outreach to a minority business, for example, or there wasn't a cost of price analysis. As long as the costs are reasonable, then they would, in a lot of cases, they would say, okay, it's okay. The costs are reasonable. We know they didn't do everything. After Hurricane Katrina, the rules kind of changed. There was a lot of concern in the Gulf area that a lot of small businesses in the Gulf were being driven out of, weren't getting the opportunities to go against the big companies coming in nationally because of a lot of sole source and some of those types of things. So I actually got called up to the Hill and met with a couple members of Congress about this, and they said, if the Inspector General is ignoring what the rules and regulations are in 2 CFR or the common rule back then before 2 CFR, which is part of everybody else's rules and regulations, then they're condoning improper procurements. And we don't think that's correct. So we went back, we discussed as a group, and then we decided that yes, if there's any part of a procurement that's not done correctly, typically what the IGs will do is question the entire thing. So it could be a very small little item, could be something pretty significant, but we talked about the cost, cost evaluations, determine those types of things. So it's going to be critical that, again, at the local level, the city level, that all of the rules, regulations are being followed as put forth in 2 CFR. And the other thing about the uniform guidance in 2 CFR is that the states can, in essence, they can follow their own procurement regulations. They don't have to be consistent with the federal. What I do find throughout the United States that they're all pretty similar. They all have a lot of those types of things. At the local level, following the procurement regulations You follow your own procurement regulations, but they must conform with the federal acquisition regulations as outlined in 2 CFR. So that's a big difference. There has to be cost. There has to be, cost analysis. There has to be cost reasonableness provisions in there. They have to have, a lot of different things in there. Or the IG is going to come along and take a look and say, you didn't follow these rules and regulations, and it's just an easy clawback. So my point is that, make sure that any procurement is being, done correctly. The other area I'm seeing a lot of local governments get in trouble with too is the use of cooperative purchase agreements when they're doing procurement. There's a lot of these buy boards or cooperative purchase agreements where a lot of there might be a couple organizations that put a lot of vendors with, so there's economies and efficiencies for local governments by using these types of buy boards and cooperative purchase agreements. But nevertheless, there should still be some level of competition. Just because a vendor is on there doesn't mean you go out and sole source. And I've seen IG reports that basically say, yes, you selected this vendor off this thing, but there were 22 other vendors. You should have tried to get a better price or, for these types of goods and services. So, I just caution folks as they're using these buy boards and these are the type of things, those are the types of things where, I've seen folks get in trouble in the past. Teha mentioned having records of the procurement. In some cases, the inspector general may not be out for several years after, the procurement is made. People leave, people get other jobs, records get lost, and the auditor is just going to question everything if the records are there. So having a good audit trail of just what happened, why decisions were made, in every step of the way. And the other issue too that I'm seeing a lot of folks struggle with is that just the color of the money. When the initial CARES Act distribution came out, OMB decided that it was not going to be subject, except for a couple of provisions of 2 CFR, but it was not considered a grant of other federal assistance. So a lot of the procurement requirements were not applicable to the initial allocation of the CARES Act fund. When ARPA came along, the rules changed. Okay, so now you have ARPA where they are applicable. So having a contract that was awarded under CARES Act and continue on to ARPA and possibly to the IIHA could be problematic. So I highly recommend you go back and take a look at those contracts and make sure they're compliant. The other thing I see a lot of is existing contracts. You have contracts within the city and you're using it for one thing and then piggybacking, changing the scope, or if the contract wasn't procured according to federal standards, that potentially could be an issue. And then finally, I know there was a big push to get funding out quickly after the CARES Act, and it was a very short fuse to get that money spent. And I see this quite a bit in some of the disaster grants where, the use of exigent circumstances, which is acceptable under certain cases, getting contracts awarded quickly because there's just not enough time to go out and do a full-blown RFP, do the evaluation that's needed. So in some cases that is okay. However, once in the disaster world, we say once the situation normalizes, if there's a long-term need for that contract, the expectation that would go out and get rebid. So, those are some of the big things I've seen when I'm dealing with the some of the contracting issues, just something to be aware of. And again, the fact that the feds will be going directly with cities as the recipients and not going through the state, so you lose that level of cover too. So next slide. Okay, so the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, when Congress was doling out their trillions of dollars for the CARES Act, for the ARPA, for all these types of stuff, they realized that there would have to be some sort of level of oversight on that. Earlier this week, I was at a conference where a lot of folks from the Department of Treasury, from the PRAC, some other federal agencies that are dealing directly with the funding that's going out there. They realize that they can't track every single dollar that's going on out there. So they're trying to come up with ways that they can create efficiencies to doing that. There are 36,000 recipients of federal dollars, either through CARES Act, ARPA. That would include states, cities, counties, tribes, territories, private not-for-profits, hospitals that receive money from the CARES Act and the Provider Relief Fund. So there's a lot of money out there. There's just simply not going to be enough oversight. So they're trying to get very creative. And the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee is part of a council that is an existing council, been around for a while, of the Inspector General on Integrity and Efficiency. I was actually part of that when I worked for DHS OIG. I know a lot of folks very well. So they were tasked by Congress, and they got a pretty good sizable appropriation to set up an oversight group to coordinate with all the federal agencies. And I believe there's 46 different federal agencies or departments that are involved in the pandemic relief fund in one shape or form. So the amount of work there is tremendous. And what they're doing, they're actually coming up with like lessons learned and those types of things. And there's a website that I'll go through later on to talk about some of those types of things. But there's, it has 21 inspector generals across the United States, and they actually publish a list of all the work that they do. They're also including work that's being done at the state level and the local level too. So a lot of information is being fed through this group. And they're actually coming up with a lot of examples of fraud, waste, and abuse that I think, if you're interested, and I'll give a couple of examples in a minute, some of the types of things that they're finding out there and how they're occurring. Next, please. So I'll run through these pretty quick because I want to allow some time for some Q's and A's. I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of questions. There was a big need to get the money out quickly. Everybody knows that. When I was chief financial officer working at FEMA, it was damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you check everything, there's people are suffering from a disaster, they need assistance. If you go and cross every T and dot every I, slows the money down, you get criticized for not getting money out quick enough. If you get the money out too quick, you have to drop some controls, and then you get criticized because there's a lot of, improper payments and some of those types of things really go. So this is a very similar situation. There was a lot of pressure. In some cases, some of these loans had to be made within like a matter of weeks, where typically it would take up to a year or so to go through the whole thing. So so they had to rely quite a bit on self-certified information. So, so obviously a lot of bad actors took advantage of the situation there. There were some issues with the Emergency Rental Assistance Program where the sole reliance is on what the recipients provided them. So there's false billing, bribery, falsified documentation. This is all in the report. But, again, with the pressure to get the money out quickly, this is causing a lot of potential. And the bad actors will learn ways to scam the system. I've seen this many years working at FEMA and the Individual Assistance Program. They'll find ways to look for weaknesses and loopholes where they can, take advantage of the situation. So the self-certified information is great. It actually is supposed to put people on alert saying, yes, I'm certifying I'm certifying that everything I say is true here and I can be, prosecuted, whatever it's going to be. But nevertheless, you still find a lot of bad actors there. Next, please. And then using existing data resources to verify eligibility. The PPP fraud is pretty interesting. What they should have been doing, and the SBA Inspector General had a lot of comments about this, was actually going and doing DUNS and doing background checks and making sure these are legitimate businesses. Again, they just not have the time to go ahead and do that. So there was a lot of fraud. Almost $3.6 billion this year to ineligible recipients. So that was probably the #1 program a lot of folks just took advantage of, saying they needed this funding and that was going to be it. The interesting thing he said is that there's been a couple of public cases right now, and there's been some pretty significant fraud in the payroll protection program. And what caught his eye as they're doing analysis is that the vehicle of choice when people defraud the government was a Lamborghini. And for some reason, people decided that they're going to defraud the government. They're going to get hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, and go out and buy a Lamborghini. That seemed to be the vehicle of choice. So he said they actually sent some agents out to the Lamborghini dealer to try to get them information. They said they can't get the Lamborghini until November of 2023 because some of them sold out. So that seemed to be the choice there. Stimulus checks fraud. Again, these are checks the IRS sent directly out. A lot of deceased individuals, a lot of people that were not eligible, a lot of people that were incarcerated, some of those types of things. So, again, these are all real life examples of what the different agencies are finding out there. Next, please. And then transparency and collaboration. This is great. I think that the IGs are doing a good job, one of the things that they're doing is that they're actually, in addition to putting on reports that they've completed, they're also reporting what is ongoing, what they have planned, which is a little bit different. And given the lack of resources, it allows like state or other agencies to say, okay, we know that this Treasury IG is looking at that. We may go somewhere else and do something else. So it's a way to do it. The problem with the collaboration is that, and I ran this a couple times after Hurricane Katrina. FEMA's got a housing program. A lot of people were displaced after Hurricane Katrina. HUD's got a housing program. How do you know that the same people weren't getting duplicate benefits? As part of the executive branch, I was precluded from sharing information from DHS FEMA with my counterparts at HUD unless it went through a long process. It was almost impossible because of Privacy Act concerns to do that. Another story is when a lot of folks were displaced in the state of Mississippi, the state police lost track of where the registered sex offenders were, and FEMA was using cruise ships to house families. And the state police wanted a list of, the register of who was on there to identify if there's any potential predators on there. And then FEMA was not allowed to do that. So it's great that you can talk about collaboration, you can share things at the high level, but keep in mind that there may be certain information that you just can't share. There could be personal and private information that's out there. That's also, we have to just be mindful of that too. So it's great. But it's very difficult to share information, from one agency to the other agency too, especially when you want to get down into details and those types of things. Next, please. And, we talk about the allegations of risk of fraud with federal funding, the CARES Act funding, just misspent funding, intentional applying for receiving applications. I want to take a quick note to build on what Mike was talking about as far as the IIJA funding. This is going to be critical because there is an element of the IIJA, the Infrastructure Jobs Act, that requires Buy America and steel, iron for a lot of these big infrastructure projects. And what I have seen, and I've seen this in the past with some of the FEMA projects that are also subject to some of the Buy America rules, is the due diligence that needs to be done to make sure that the suppliers of these types of goods, whether they're the contractor, they're the subcontractor, there's the subcontractor, getting to know have they been indications of where they have provided counterfeit goods. Are they disbarred from the federal government? Are they, are there opportunities there where they can replace or inferior type products? So there's going to be a lot of due diligence that's going to be involved. And I think, when Mike talked about the monitoring, I think it's going to be critical to a lot of these IIJ funding projects where, the requirements of the Buy America Act is going to increase the risk for, potential fraud and waste. Next, please. I just want to go through quickly some best practices here. I'm starting to see right now, actually one of our clients is now being subject to an audit by the Department of Treasury. They're starting what they call their desk audits. But from what I gather, they're not really audits. Typically when you're having your single audit that's being done, you're really familiar with what IG does, a comprehensive audit. They're done by they're governed by what they call the Generally Accepted Government Auditing Standards, or Yellow Book. The Treasury auditors said they're not going to use Yellow Book, so the standards will not be as deep, which I find unusual. They'll be doing desk audits, and they'll be looking at data at a high level. So one of the things that's interesting about that is that when Treasury developed their reporting, they didn't want to put a big burden on the reporting requirements. So basically anything under $50,000 that you spend on contracts and those types of things, you report in the aggregate. These auditors are asking for that information down to very detailed, so, we're reporting at one level and they're asking information at another level, which is kind of frustrating in a lot of respects. But the other thing that Treasury OIG is going to be doing, and I think it's critical for almost everybody on this phone, is that because they can't be everywhere, they realize they can't, look at every single recipient that's receiving these dollars. They have to do some risk assessment at the high level. And one of the primary tools they're going to use for the risk assessment is the results of the single audit. They're going to be looking closely at the results of the single audit to identify, are there material deficiencies, are there major internal control weaknesses that would result in a high-risk subrecipient where they may want to go out and take a look at that or do a desk audit or some other type of thing. So it's critical that when you're doing your A133, a lot of the things we talked about on the phone regarding documentation and putting together the story to tell the auditors, making sure that you're compliant with the procurement requirements, understanding what the rules, the different rules are for the different pots of money out there, it's going to be critical, because if there are some major deficiencies, it's going to increase the likelihood that you're going to receive a knock on the door by some of the Federal Inspector General's office. So, keep that in mind. What we have up here, there's a lot of information out on what the OIG does, and some resources are out there. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I highly recommend that you take a look at the PRAC website. It's done by state, it's done by audit agency, it's done by a number of different ways you can do different types of sorts. It's a very valuable tool to give you some sort of idea of, number one, where the IG is going to be looking, the types of things they're looking at, and how they're reporting those types of things. Because I have done my 30 years in the government, I put out a lot of audit reports. Sometimes they're not pretty. You get that blemish of having a bad report you have to deal with. There's a lot of different things that could be uncovered there. So certainly taking a look at some of these types of trainings and resources will go a long way in helping you achieve a good audit, tell the story, make sure that you have the controls in place, and it'll actually probably reduce your likelihood of getting an audit. And I won't go through this again. Establish a separate, I think number 3 here, designate a person to coordinate the accumulation of records. I think having that one point of contact versus going to an agency or, having the auditors ask a lot of different people is probably going to be critical. Maintaining all the invoice documentation, one of the big areas is subrecipient monitoring. There's been a lot of discussion about subrecipient monitoring. So having, evidence that risk assessments were being done or risk evaluations were being done, and also monitoring reports was really critical. That's something I think that the IG is going to take a really close look on. So, and again, it's an onerous process, but I think the more you can document at points in time when decisions are made, and again, it was a moving target. As I mentioned earlier, CARES Act had a different set of rules, and then the ARPA came out, and Treasury started with a separate set of FAQs that evolved into interim final rule that evolved into a final rule that is now getting FAQs again. So, there's different interpretations of different rules and regulations at certain times. So, keeping a record of that, just when the auditors come in, they start putting things together. If you have a clear record of what decisions were made at what point in time and why they were made and what the criteria was, I think it's going to go a long way to help you get through the audit. And these are just a reminder of a couple of updated deadlines. So I can talk all day on this. Again, I used to work and I used to be the guy that did the clawbacks. We're now working with state and local governments. It's much more pleasurable. Being on this side, we're actually working with state and local governments to help them understand what the rules are, how to comply. If we have any questions, I'd be glad to answer any questions at this point. So thank you for your time.
Matt, and we're glad that you're working with us on this program and that we can both get the benefit of some of these tips of the trade that you provided today. And as I indicated in the chat, if anybody wants to follow up with any specifics, some of this stuff is sensitive. If you want to do a one-on-one with Matt, Mike, Teha, you're welcome to do that by putting your question into the e311 website, which Jamie has put in. I'm also glad that we were able to take a couple of questions during the program. There's a few more that came in. And so just in the last couple of minutes to Teha, Mike, perhaps, or Matt, how can a legitimate, honest MBE, which is a grant subrecipient, protect itself from a prime or the prime awardee who may be inclined to make misrepresentations about the MBE, the use of the MBE. If the MBE doesn't have all the records, the total budget, the total disbursements, what's being represented at the macro level. So how can an honest MBE protect itself from that sort of fraudulent behavior by its prime? Any thoughts on that?
You want to take this?
Yeah, I'll take the first stab. So I think that's a really great question, right? And I think that kind of plays into one of the things that we spoke about before is having the ability to be able to report misconduct without feeling any sort of repercussions against them. And a MWDBE may not want to go to a program directly with the fear that their prime may know what they're trying to disclose. So having a mechanism to be able to report anonymously any sort of misconduct of anything that they think is being misrepresented on their behalf, I think is really important for that community, because they don't want to lose business, right? And they don't want to, seem like they're going against their contractor, but they want to make sure that their company is being used legitimately. And so that's one of the key ways that they can go about reporting it.
Yeah, Terry, if I can just add to that, I know a lot of times legitimate MWE companies, almost fall victim to the larger companies who want to pull them into some of their fraudulent schemes. And I think it's important, and I know we start to do it a lot, educating the MWE community to, what are some of the common, areas of how you're being used. Because sometimes when these cases would surface, we would go to the MWBE and, they would almost acknowledge what was happening, and they would think nothing was wrong with it, right? They're benefiting the company, they're making some money, but they're just outside the rules and regulations of the program. So it's important, to get to that community and educate them as much as possible so they don't fall victim. Because when they do, what happens often is the MWBE can't survive those type of inquiries, but yet the larger company ends up surviving it anyway.
Any thoughts about how an MBE can know whether or not the prime is inflating, for example, its quote unquote material participation? There are records that can be checked by the MBE as it relates to the project to make sure that there is no inflation or misrepresentation being made about them.
Yeah, absolutely. There are quarterly reports that are generally required on these projects, that as part of the report, they're submitting, the effort put forward by the MWBE. It'll be the projects that they're working on, it'll be the dollar amount that, that was paid to that firm. So those quarterly reports are something that, they should be providing them at the asking. That's a good thing to look at it. But those reports, and I think that's across the board, that you're going to see quarterly reports on MWB participation across all projects. So yes, they absolutely can check on what's being reported about them on those reports.
Yeah, in addition to that, a lot of cities are now using more electronic means of having the subcontractors confirm what they're being paid, the amounts they're being paid, and the rates and the work that they're doing, even before the prime is approved for payment. So that's another way that they can review it. If they're looking at these electronic submittals and they think that something doesn't match up, then that's the time to kind of report it to the agency, like, hey, this is not what we've been paid for. This is not the rate in which we're receiving. So that's another way that cities are using verification processes.
That's great. Thank you guys so much for that. I'm going to launch a little poll. If you can all fill that out while we tee up the next question. And the question was whether it is inappropriate for a consultant to assist with a grant application for free. Is this considered a quote unquote gift? What if, after assisting with a grant application, they want to compete during a competitive process for contracting opportunities on that grant, if awarded? Does anyone want to try to answer that one?
Sure. Yeah, I'll give it a shot. It's a really good question. You know, I would imagine, or I would hope that, you know, there are some rules and regulations about having folks do, you know, volunteer work or whatever you may call it. I think it's a risky road to go down. To do that because of what you just said, right? You know, they're doing a favor, and there are appearance issues here more than anything, right? That if I'm doing, you know, a favor for a particular city for free, and then I do submit on a project and I get it, whether there's misconduct or not, there's an appearance there, you know, potentially that, oh, that's, you know, they got that contract because they had given you free work, and it may put pressure on other folks to feel like they need to do, you know, this kind of free work up front in order to obtain contracts later. So, you know, I would say be very cautious with that, because that can create a heavy conflict appearance. But it's a good question. I would really need to wrap my head around that a little bit more.
Yeah, I've seen that in the past where actually they have folks in helping write the, you know, the scope of work for a project to get the inside information. They're no longer independent, and, you know, the optics, and to me, it's just it's an unfair advantage. You know, so it's just not something that's, you know, I don't, you know, if they're taking an application or helping prepare an application, that's fine. But if they're ultimately going to bid on the same application that they're preparing for it, I think that's a major, major problem.
I'll just cap it off with, in New York, we saw that, and the city was just as careful about things that were being offered to it for free by vendors and entities. And when down the road, the company that did something for free then ends up with a contract, the losing bidders in that scenario are alerted to and feel that there was an unfair advantage that took place in connection with what should have been a more fair and competitive process. So be careful about taking free services from a company that may turn around and put itself into the mix, because it could be complicated and garner allegations of impropriety.
Yeah, certainly subject for a protest too.
Thank you, Matt. I was just going to say, Jamie, thank you so much for launching that survey, and I will turn it over to you maybe to close this out.
Thank you so much, Rose. Thank you all for attending today's workshop. As we've shared before, all the materials will be posted to the website as well as the recording. And as Rose mentioned, please feel free to reach out to us through the program website, through our email, or by, pick up the phone, give us a call if you need any assistance, and if you want to schedule a call with one of our wonderful experts. Thank you to Cobra and Kim, to Probity, to EY for these excellent presentations. And we look forward to helping you all as you navigate the morass that is federal funding. Take care.